Happy Sunday, everyone. Welcome to another Sunday Musing. In this one, I am going to advocate for selling off or shutting down Deseret Book. Faithful viewers and listeners of Sunday Musings may remember 2.5 years ago, I did a somewhat similar musing about why the church needed to sell KSL and the Deseret News. I will link to that musing in the YouTube description. You can go to sundaymusings.org, just type in KSL, you'll find it. But today we're talking about Deseret Book. Have you been recently, or at all in many, many years, to a Deseret Book? You'll walk in, and perhaps you will have a question that I had last time I was in there, is like, how much shelf space is actually dedicated to things that promote and further faith and gospel understanding and testimony? There's tons of other books. There's lots of kitsch, lots of art, lots of jewelry and knickknacks and whatever. And so next time you go, if you haven't been recently, take a look at the shelf space and analyze. I'm not going to give you this answer. You get to go do your own research trip. What percentage of shelf space is dedicated to, LDS books versus other stuff? The answer might interest you. But as we zoom out of that question about Deseret Book in particular and just look at bookstores, what we find is, unsurprisingly, so you can see in this chart here, a steady decline in the revenue that bookstores are receiving, particularly for physical books. A lot of reading has gone online. A lot of reading is free. I'll be sharing some clips later from Laurel, the current CEO of Deseret Book. I won't be including this one, where in one of her interviews she talks about how their biggest competition is the church in the library app, right? Where so many of this information and essays and what do you call them, manuals and whatever, right? It's all free. It's online. It's easy. It's super accessible. And so she rightly points out that the church itself puts out some of this information for free. Broadly in the industry, it's the same thing. You got podcasts and you got YouTube videos and you got, ebooks that are super cheap. And so bookstores writ large have been struggling. Some, have been making a slight comeback, but especially the mom and pop stores, the smaller chains, struggle compared to, say, a Barnes and Noble that can monetize enough different things to withstand those trends. So the question we have to then ask is, if that trend holds true of Deseret Book, are our tithing dollars, and I loosely use quotes around the word our because tithing is the Lord's and it's not like it's our money once we've, been commanded to provide it. You understand what I mean. I won't say our, I'll just say, is tithing money, our tithed dollars, including the widow's mite, subsidizing the business activities of Deseret Book? Other bookstores can and have gone out of business. This one is being propped up. And as I pointed out a moment ago, any member of the church has access to voluminous amounts of church-related content, including out-of-copyright stuff on, Google Books online and all kinds of stuff. It's just so easy to find this information. And so are we, in a way, kind of indirectly subsidizing Deseret Book? Well, even if we are, who cares? One might say we ought to care when Deseret Book is found to be promoting all kinds of, let's say, secular things, ideas incompatible with the gospel and so forth. Let's pick on just a couple. I say this perhaps with a little bit of context. I remember when I published my first book, Latter-day Liberty. It was through Cedar Fort, a smaller publisher of LDS books. They don't have any bookstores. They sell, online. They have their own little warehouse you can go buy at, but they've always kind of published through other LDS bookstores. I'll talk about some of those that have been gobbled up by Deseret Book, or they'll publish online and so forth, right? And so when I published my first book through Cedar Fort, what was that, 2009? I don't know, somewhere around there. Or no, maybe that was 2011. That's what it was, because Mitt Romney was running for president. So it was like 2011, somewhere around there. And I was told in kind of no uncertain terms by various people, like, don't even bother. Deseret Book won't touch your book. It's too political. And that they had this kind of anti-political bit, which is funny because when you go to Deseret Book, often over the years when I've gone to look at the non-LDS books, they've got, like Hillary Clinton's book or Obama or just random like political people with heavily political and non-gospel ideas and content. Not only non-gospel, I would say in many cases inconsistent with the gospel. So I've kind of had that from like, my mom, who I'll mention in a little bit, she's published numerous books with Deseret Book. Of course, hers aren't, politically charged. They're more kind of mainline, faith and family and things like that. And so she had published a number of books early on with them, but I kind of never had that, that path, not only to publish books directly with them, but for their stores to even really carry my books because of their political implications. So, here, for example, is a photo of Deseret Book during Black History Month, right? Promoting all these titles, none of which have to do with the gospel of Jesus Christ. I guess there's there's standout saints. So there's some stories of some Black Latter-day Saints or Child of God, but you've got different stories here that are just, here are Black people. So it's Black History Month, which I like Thomas Sowell, who himself is Black, and others like him who, point out how silly that is. We don't have White History Month. We don't have other things. And Deseret Book is very much kind of leaning into whatever marketing opportunities they can. It kind of feels like it's like what Barnes and Noble would do, right? But this is part of like a broader DEI initiative on the part of the Deseret Book Institution to specifically try and go in that direction. In 2023, there's an organization called Latter-day Saints in Publishing, Media, and the Arts, LDS-PMA, and they host a conference every year for, authors and content creators and others in the LDS space. And at their 2023 conference, there was a panel called The Many Dimensions of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Publishing, How the New Deseret Book Intercultural Team is Confronting Challenges and Applying What They Learned. So this panel included Laurel, the CEO. Again, we'll hear from her in just a little bit, as well as a few other people. One of them was J. Teresa Davis. She was the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Manager for Deseret Book for about a year. Didn't really have any relevant experience. She was like teaching English at university and whatever. And so she had that role for about 13 months before either being fired or quitting. I don't know. So she was on the panel along with Laurel. So was Levi Haperi, who was and remains the director of intercultural strategy, where he, quote, oversees the company's DEI initiatives. Then the other person on that panel, who is far more, shall we say, outspoken in her DEI-ness, is Jalynn Getty. And she... I'll share just a couple examples of many that I found online from her social media. So when Charlie Kirk died, here's the screenshot you can see, and I'll read it for those who aren't watching the video version. She posts this quote from some reverend, which says, if we Christians somehow arrive at the conclusion that giving up some personal liberties for the sake of other people's safety somehow makes us less free, then we have deeply misunderstood the cross. Right. And so she's like uncritically posting this social media, little image. And then she says, this post is for Christians, a community I'm part of and feel a lot of accountability for. The shooting happened 20 minutes from my home on a campus my friends work at, a campus my friends attend and live even closer to. This has impacted the safety of all of them. And please follow this other account. She's sharing how this is affecting HBCUs. It's affecting Black communities and all communities that the person who was killed used to malign. Keep in mind, this gal is not herself Black. When you talk about this, and I'm not policing anyone, talk about it however you want, please understand innocent, marginalized people are more in danger now than ever before. So please, gun control now. I want everyone safe, even the people I've disagreed with on every single issue, even the people who don't have an ounce of empathy for me. I want all gun violence to stop. That's just a very basic thing to start with. My safety is bound up in yours. Our safety is bound up in each other. And then she has this concluding paragraph. Understand this. I want any tears shed for Charlie Kirk to also be shed for 2SLGBTQIA people, for Palestinians, for every person who has not shown empathy and understanding by him, Charlie, when he was alive. Right now is the time for right-wingers to put their money where their mouth is and show that humanity for innocent people who are suffering, even if it didn't happen 20 minutes away from you. Otherwise, you are continuing, she says, to deeply misunderstand the cross, quoting the post that she shared. She has another post where she says that this country was born out of genocide and slavery. She has another one where she's wearing this hat that says, "You're on native land." For a while, as I was scrolling her social media, there was nothing indicating that she's LDS. Like, what little she posts about her religion openly just drips with leftist ideology. Here, for example, is a post from about a year and a half ago. She says, "I don't always talk about my faith on here, not because I'm ashamed of it, but because my primary audience and priority is my Nahia and indigenous community." I'm sure I mispronounced that. "The religious trauma we have as a result of the residential schools and colonization is still immediate and painful, and that's important to me. I truly want everyone here to feel welcome and safe. It's also Pride Month, and I know there's an added layer of religious trauma for people who are also 2SLGBTQIA+. But I wanted to share something, and it's important I include my Christian identity in it. There is a lot happening in this country that is violent and unsafe. Every small step forward seems to be met with aggressive resistance, and there's no denying that people who call themselves Christian can often be behind that resistance. I wish I had more to say, but this is not my month to take up space. It's my responsibility and accountability to create safe spaces for anyone who is 2SLGBTQIA+, especially as a Christian. I know that there are out people who attend church. I know that there are closeted people who attend church. And I know that Christian spaces are often not safe for them. I know they can be places of pain. I know how much safety and change is needed in those spaces. And I know that Christian spaces need people committed to the labor of bringing safety to the out or closeted people who are there too. Because we as Christians cannot say we follow Christ until we follow his most basic teaching to love one another. And that means changing ourselves, not changing or controlling others. Take care of each other, relatives, and happy Pride this month and always. So stuff like that, right? I know, like, just, and there's lots more, just leftist. And there's nothing as like, why does this person work for Deseret News? And so it took me a little bit digging, because it wasn't apparent from her own social media, but there's a group called Indigenous Latter-day Saint Women. She is listed there as one of them. There's the mega leftist Mormon Women for Ethical Government, just a lefty group. She's on their advisory council, right? And so this is a gal who, is part of the DEI initiative of Deseret Book with the other individuals I mentioned. And so you look at that and you're like, all right, some like clearly like activist-oriented person. Now, like a lot of people on the left, a lot of their criticisms, like some of what she's saying, the colonialism, the residential schools, the treatment of, Native people, there's justifiable, criticism and like legit trauma that happened to people that were, roped up. And I mean, go read the Trail of Tears if you just want one tiny example of many. So it's not that like her criticisms are without merit in kind of a broad context. It's just that so often people on the left are horrible with their prescribed solutions to those problems. But regardless of your opinion, like here is an individual like that employed by Deseret Book along with her peers to work on DEI. So like, well, wait a minute, if in fact tithing dollars are subsidizing this type of operation, and whether they even aren't, it's clearly got the imprimatur and the blessing and the added whatever of the church, right? It's not this distinct company that can do whatever it wants with DEI. Like this is a church-owned, 100% church-owned initiative under the Deseret Management Corporation. So there's a lot of implications here. So, I mean, there's more on the DEI. Let's move on. Obviously, there's the LGBT stuff. Some of you who, again, have been listening a while may remember Richard Ostler. I did a musing on him, well, not so much on him, on one of the individuals he interviewed on his podcast. That musing is called Gender Wars in the Church. Again, I'll link to it, but you can go to sundaymusings.org and just type Gender Wars. You'll find it. And in that podcast, this gentleman, Richard Ostler, who holds himself out to be this walking safe space for, I guess, 2SLGBTQIA plus people. That's a mouthful. In the podcast, he's interviewing this trans person who, purported to be put on the rolls of the church in the assumed gender and not the actual gender. So again, you can go listen to that whole thing and its implications for the church. I bring him up here because He has a book called Listen, Learn, and Love, Embracing LGBTQ Latter-day Saints. And, one little quote from that book, he says, for example, straight kids are never taught they should hold off putting a label on themselves. This is part of how the shame, the awareness of being broken or wrong begins. Yes, they know they are LGBTQ at a young age. These precious young children also carry to varying degrees the burden of hiding that identity. So it's just, again, this very deep leftist type of perspective, advancing ideas, philosophies, worldly and otherwise, that I think are incompatible with certainly the Proclamation on the Family, let alone broader church doctrine. Some of you may remember several months ago, there was the whole brouhaha on social media over an ex-Mormon author's book being promoted by Deseret Book. Here is the ad that popped up on social media from Deseret Book saying, whether you want to better understand the temple, to get more out of General Conference, or to glean insights from Latter-day Prophets, you can find the resources at Deseret Book. Free shipping on orders $49 and above. And then what was promoted in the image is a book from Shannon and Dean Hale called The Princess in Black and the Prince in Pink. Here from the inside of the book, you can see, the prince wearing a tiara and, sparkly mask, and he was no longer Prince Valerian. He's basically transing himself in a way. And, there's the one website ranked it as one of the best LGBTQ inclusive early readers for ages 6 to 9. Calling the character a gender creative prince. So, first off, let me make a concession. That ad that people are responding to, 99% don't know how Facebook ads work. This is not to excuse it, more to explain it. On Facebook, there's a way to basically tie in your e-commerce catalog. So you basically give it some text, and then you just say, go create a bunch of ads with all my different SKUs, my different books in this case. And Facebook will be like, okay, let's match that text with this, and that text with this, and that text with this. And part of it is testing. You're seeing which images, which books, therefore, are more attractive to people, what more likely gets them to click and go buy. So this was not someone at Deseret Book on the DEI team or otherwise, or LGBT, whatever, saying, let's take that paragraph saying, if you want to understand the temple or hear from Latter-day Prophets, and then also consciously saying, let's take this little, Prince in Pink book and create an ad. No, this was an automated system that was doing it. Now, the broader critique is, why is Deseret Book carrying a title like this at all? So there was a big online, backlash from more conservative types and flooding Deseret Book with emails and calls. They had this on their website, for sale. They had it in at least some stores for sale. And I don't know what happened to the in-store versions, but online, in response to the pressure, they pulled down the listing to this book. So, there's concerns like that, because that carries some type of weight, some type of implication, at least for some members of the church, at varying degrees of their understanding of, church culture or whatever, where people might differently interpret, like, oh, okay, the church is publishing a book like this, therefore, especially in our culture where it's this very kind of authoritarian, like, the Lord would never let, the president of the church lead it astray, and the president of the church is in charge of the Deseret Management Corporation, which is in charge of Deseret Book, which is in charge of the titles being acquired, which is, is what's displayed on the website or carried in stores. Like this presumption that, oh, if it were bad, the Lord would intervene because everything bubbles up to the president of the church and the Lord would never let him, this very anti-agency view of the church, but it's prevalent. I've talked about it many times. Rather than people have agency, people are fallible. Large corporations and institutions make lots of bad decisions, and those decisions are not always known to the people at the top at all. So there's concerns, right? And even if you just look from an ideological or a spiritual perspective, okay, does it make sense that Deseret Book with that imprimatur is with that kind of mantle of churchness and approval from church leaders? Does it make sense to be carrying titles like this, or Hillary Clinton's, or whoever's, right? Does that make sense? Are we just creating some problems if in our church culture there's this kind of rigid interpretation? And so if you're selling these other books, are people going to then assume that they are compatible in the gospel, and not just that Deseret Book is just trying to make some money to stay afloat? More on that in just a minute. First, let's talk about competitors. Deseret Book made two major acquisitions. In 1999, it was Bookcraft. And some of the older viewers might remember Bookcraft. For years after the acquisition, Bookcraft was one of the imprints of Deseret Book. An imprint, for those who don't know, is like, you have a big publishing company, and they'll have different, like, almost sub brands under which they can publish, different titles for different audiences. So they did that with Bookcraft for a while, and that imprint was used for like self-help books or families books or LDS fiction, things like that. A few years later, 2006, there was Covenant Communications, which was a publisher, and then its sister company, which was Siegel Book and Tape, the retail chain. Those were acquired together in 2006. And that, at the time, was Deseret Book's largest competitor in LDS publishing. Siegel, for its part, continued to operate as a separate, like, discount-oriented retail chain by Deseret Book for almost, 2 decades now, when at the end of last year, 2025, the Siegel bookstores were all closed. So why is that relevant or important? Well, if it's one thing for independent stores to carry, books from Connor Boyack or whatever Mormon author for an LDS audience, and I don't think anyone really has the same kind of spiritual conflation that you get when a church-owned institution is the one publishing these books, even from church members, let alone people who aren't of our faith. And so I think it's a better thing and less confusing thing for members of the church to have access to this type of content, but from institutions that don't bring that same kind of theocratic stamp of approval. So by buying out the competitors and effectively shutting them down and consolidating, the members of the church are really left with only one go-to resource. Now, obviously, that's not entirely true because of self-publishing and Amazon and direct-to-consumer models. And, like, I've published religious books and created my own imprint, Social Harmony, right, for you to be able to go and get books. And so it's never been easier than in our day to still have direct-to-consumer distribution models. So, like in my case, you go to socialharmony.org. And, you've seen, if you watch the video versions of my musings, you see the little banner popping up at bottom with my books, right? So now anyone can do that. There's little pop-up imprints, but none of them are as big as, Siegel was, or Covenant Communications, or Bookcraft. So things have been kind of consolidated for most of the kind of major publishing in the LDS space. And that's something that Laurel Day, the CEO's, talked about. Let's share a couple interview clips that she's given. Let's begin with this one from April 2024 on a podcast where they're talking about some of their DEI work.
Last year, so I heard you speak at Mormon Women for Ethical Government at their conference, MWIC, and it feels like you're doing really hard work trying to make sure that you're aware of blind spots by inviting more voices to the table and just trying to expand the perspectives that you're aware of as a leader and maybe just as Deseret Book generally. And so I would love for you to just talk about why you feel like that has been so crucial to the mission of Deseret Book and why it's been important to you.
Yeah, it's such a group effort with an organization our size. And there are a lot of people that are passionate about the work. I think I got to a point in my personal life, looking at the world, in the church, in my work, where I realized that so much of our worldviews or our ways of approaching things are because of our lived experience. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, if we're missing proximity to other lived experiences, we're missing a huge part of the story and the conversation. So I was single until I didn't get married till I was 41. And I learned, if you don't know somebody who's single, if you haven't been in the trenches with somebody who's single, you don't know how certain things that are said or certain things that are done at church impact someone who has not lived a more traditional path. Well, the same is true for our LGBTQ brothers and sisters and our Black members. It doesn't matter if you only rely on your lived experience, you're missing out. And so I think part of our job at Deseret Book is to provide that proximity if you don't have it in your normal circles.
I said DEI, but obviously all the LGBT stuff is part of that, where she sees her purpose or perspective is to basically be providing for, white American conservative Latter-day Saints what they don't have access to in their normal circles. And, from all reports that I hear, Laurel is fully bought into these type of leftist perspectives and philosophies, and has resolved them in her own mind as being compatible with the gospel. In fact, she, in some of these interviews, intentionally says as much, that she sees them as an outgrowth of the gospel of Jesus Christ, being nice to people and loving people, and therefore interprets everything through that lens. In the same interview, she talks about finances. And given that I'm here advocating for shutting down Deseret Book, in part because of, declining, revenues for bookstores, that tithe payers should not be subsidizing this activity, that it's hardly even books anymore. It's now just other stuff like art and garments and whatever. It just doesn't make sense. It perhaps and likely made sense at one point in time, but I don't think it any longer does. I think there are ways, as I'll say in my concluding remarks, to get the saints what they need without this current model and its implications. But here is from the same interview, Laurel talking about finances. This is a 5-minute clip, but I think the whole portion that I'm including here is important for you to see the context that she's talking about, and how she and the church think about Deseret Book in a financial perspective.
I'm curious how you think about financial stewardship, if it's okay to ask about this a little bit. Like, obviously, so Deseret Book is a for-profit entity. It rolls up through DMC to the church itself, which is obviously a faith-based nonprofit institution. I'm curious, and obviously the majority of your revenue, as I understand it, comes from church members who are looking for various media to help them along the way in their faith journey in some way. So I'm curious how that sort of affects the way you think about pricing and how much profit you should be generating and your margins and things like that. Like, what's your financial philosophy?
So,
sorry, is that too?
No, let me say
Okay.
a couple of things. I think that's a perfectly fine question. There are years when being a for-profit company, that's a very loosely used term.
Okay.
Right?
We're very familiar with this.
At the end of the day, we're in a retail business, whether it's e-commerce or brick and mortar, where you look around. I mean, when was the last time you walked? Borders doesn't even exist anymore. And so the fact that we're for-profit means that we need to pay our way at the end of the day. And we need to be self-funding and self-sustainable. And so we're very conscious about, here's a great example. Costs of materials and labor have gone up. When was the last time you paid $100 for a book? You're still paying $20, right?
Yeah.
Prices of books are not changing.
Yeah.
So our margins have gotten thinner and thinner and thinner. Now that's our problem. We've got to figure out how to reinvent pieces of our business so that we can be self-sustaining on other pieces. But I'm actually grateful for the question, because I think that's one of the tensions sometimes for people with a company like Deseret Book. And I think it's okay for me to say this again. I mean, the for-profit, that is a very loose term, because we're lucky on any given year to pay our way, truly. And it's that way for a lot of businesses in general that are in this space, in whether it's in publishing or you're in the retail space. So I feel like our job is to be good financial stewards of what we have. And there will be times when we sell a lot of something in particular that allows us to do the Let's Talk About series, for example, that isn't the best-selling series.
Yeah.
In fact, if we were just making a strictly financial decision on the Let's Talk About series, we would have never done it.
Wow.
Because the margins it's just not there. We're doing those books at like $10.99. But I mean, they're essentially $10 books, bite-sized pieces on topics that we hope will make a difference. But there's not a financial reason to do that series.
Yeah.
There's a mission reason to do that series.
Yes.
And so every year we're balancing out what we're doing that's mission driven, what we are doing that will pay for that mission driven product. The priestcraft thing.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, I mean, my whole career.
Okay. Talk my about that
career. And here's the bottom line: anybody that accuses us of priestcraft, in my personal opinion, has not actually studied the definition of priestcraft in the Book of Mormon. Because at the end of the day, it's all about where are you pointing people to. And so I would suggest people look at that with the favorite podcaster they like to listen to that's gospel oriented, or favorite author, or favorite whoever. Are people pointing you to Jesus and to his teachings, or are they pointing you to them as the end all be all expert of whatever? To me, Deseret Book's role is to help point people to the Savior. And in the art that we do and the offerings that we have, does that mean every single thing that we do is going to be specifically, obviously, Jesus oriented? No, but in the end, it better be. In the end, it better be. And so my understanding of Prescript, I had to get very comfortable with this early on in my career. And what I realized is the intention and the motivation is what matters in the end.
Yeah.
If people felt like we didn't offer value to them in their lives, we wouldn't exist.
Yeah.
You know?
It's interesting to hear that. It's not a normal for-profit corporation. Like if you were a publicly traded company and you said, well, this is great for our mission, but it was really terrible for our profitability, like that would not fly.
Yeah, we're not selling stock.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Like there's nobody buying into a publisher and a retailer these days. But we have the benefit of having this amazing legacy and heritage, and our goal and our intention is again just to provide enough that it pays for these mission-driven things that we are striving to do.
Yeah.
And if we can do that in a given year, then that's great.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah, that's so beautiful.
What was interesting to me is that there was something clipped out of that. Those of you who are only watching the audio or listening to the audio version of the Musing will not have caught it. They did a pretty good job of stitching it together from an audio perspective. But if you go back and watch the video clip, if you missed it, you can clearly see where part of her remarks were clipped out. Makes me wonder what was left out. Where she says, I think it's okay for me to say this, the for-profit, that is a loose term because, and then there's a cut right there. And then she continues, we're lucky on any given year for us to pay our way. We're lucky, which means it's rare. And so that's a clear admission from the CEO of Deseret Book that on the whole, Deseret Book is being subsidized, if not by tithing, at least by other revenue from other church-owned businesses under Deseret Management Corporation. Which, at the end of the day, all of those are an extension of tithing. All of the revenue originated from tithings and offerings, right? It's not like the church has other ways of getting businesses started other than using these original dollars. So ultimately, it all comes back, I think, to the tithe payer. Let's next go to a interview she did with the Salt Lake Tribune a few weeks after that 2023 conference that I mentioned, where she was speaking on a DEI panel for the LDS Publishing Media and Arts Conference. And so here she is talking about all kinds of things, but now she's going to make that connection that I mentioned between this kind of DEI related stuff. She highlights the fact that there was pushback to that when it came out, and then she ties it from her perspective to the gospel. Take a listen.
It's interesting to me. I participated in a panel just a couple of weeks ago, and someone had a very negative reaction to the idea of diversity and inclusion work. And to me, truly, that is the work of the gospel of Jesus Christ. I think it's unfortunate that things have become so politicized on every front, and our attempts to make space and not just make space, but like elevate voices and stories that haven't been told and haven't been heard. To me, that is part of my responsibility in my baptismal covenant of bearing others' burdens and mourning with those that mourn. And so I'm really proud of the work that we're doing to make sure that all members of the church have a chance to read stories from all other members of the church. And we've done really important training with our store associates. We want people to come into the stores, and regardless of what the difference is, that they're welcome at Deseret Book. And we're working really hard to make that happen. And part of that is going to require content creators trusting us with their work so that we can publish and provide their work for our customers. But it is all connected. And to me, it goes back to the mission. Racism has to be rooted out. And the only way it's going to be rooted out is if we're willing to do the work to dig it out and to do things differently than we've done them in the past.
Now, for those who have ears to hear, what you hear are coded leftwords. the stuff that these kind of leftist academics and activists say all the time, right? Lamenting that things have become politicized while politicizing them, or perpetuating things that are political, saying that you should make space, hold space. At least she didn't say hold space. I hate that term. I don't know where it come from, but that is, I really do not like that term. But making space, that, like, sure, in a broader context, I understand the point that's being conveyed, but like, you very clearly hear this in a more leftist orientation about bringing in people who have these different philosophies and ideologies and so forth. Her also saying racism has to be rooted out. We have to be willing to do the work. I mean, just the mannerism, like the terms being used are so clearly oriented from these leftist communities where you hear them most frequently. Of course, diversity inherently is non-problematic. You know, like it's fine. It's neutral in my viewpoint. Diversity per se is not bad. Inclusion is not even neutral. Like, it can be good, right? It's good to include people. Like, these things aren't inherently bad, right? Of course, she didn't mention equity there. She mentioned diversity and inclusion. Odd that she didn't mention equity, perhaps because equity itself is straight up Marxist. But these words, even though she abandoned equity there, even though she's talking about diversity and inclusion, on their face, while they may be neutral or fine or even positive, these words are being used in a specific context in which other meaning, politicized meaning, is inherent. It just is. You can't pretend that it's not. And those who are trying to pretend are really just trying to adopt the neutral or positive mantle of these words on their own to ram through the political implications and societal shifts that are part and parcel of their use in a modern DEI-oriented context. That's why there's been the backlash to DEI. That's why many corporations who once swallowed it whole have now been tossing it aside, because many people's eyes have been open. One final clip from Laurel Day and from that same conference. There was a breakout session where she was speaking. I mentioned my mom earlier. My mom was actually in that breakout session, which I didn't know until I was watching this clip and listening to Laurel Day's remarks. So my mom asked this question about, like, okay, does it make sense, or what are the circumstances in which Deseret Book is not just distributing and marketing its own books, but what it would look like for other LDS authors to gain access to Deseret Book as a distribution vehicle, right? So that's the question, the context for it. Here's a snippet, a portion of Laurel's remarks.
So think about that. We still have space on shelves that we need to fill. Now, our store floor plan is different, though. You'll see when you go into a Deseret Book, more art, more home decor, more jewelry, those kinds of things. But at the end of the day, we still know, I mean, we're called Deseret Book, for crying out loud. Like, we have to have a certain number of books every day still. And so, yes, there's technically more shelf space for outside titles than there were when we were publishing more titles. But it's also true that there was also more book space when we were publishing more titles.
So again, if you live far away from a Deseret Book, you haven't been there for a while, the CEO just told you herself, right? You walk in, what do you see? It's art, it's home decor, it's jewelry, it's all the kitsch, it's plus all the garments in the back, you know? But at the end of the day, we're Deseret Book. We have to have a certain number of books, but like, still, as she says otherwise in her remarks, a large portion of them are not LDS. She talks about how, like, margins are better for them as a business if they're promoting their own books versus promoting other people's books, because then they have to buy them wholesale, so it costs Deseret Book more to acquire other people's books and then promote them. So the margins are better. I left that part out because that's just whatever. But she's here admitting, like, we have to sell a certain number of books because that's in the name. But yeah, the shelves are full of all this other stuff. So ultimately, the question is, what's the point of this business anymore? Why should the church even operate this at all? If Deseret Book was a private company, completely separate from ownership and control of the church, I wouldn't care what they carried. I mean, I might have opinions about it, like I do having opinions of like here in Lehigh where I'm at, there's like this local bookstore, and you know, and teens are walking in and kids, and the owners are trying to be all like catchy or whatever. So they got, you know, juvenile, what do they call it, YA stuff, and lots of like open door romance stuff, meaning like sex scenes in them, and they had this little like display thing. What did it say? It had the F word. I think it said like cute as F, but like spelled out, and my wife was in there because my daughter loves reading and loves going to bookstores. And so like, yeah, that's a private bookstore. I still have opinions about it. I can still lament the cultural degradation that we, and especially today's youth, are just swimming and drowning in. So look, if Deseret Book was totally sold off or whatever, I'd still have opinions, but I would care a whole lot less, because what a church-owned enterprise does is a reflection of the church. Libertas Network, my nonprofit, owns and has acquired for-profit companies, either portions thereof or wholly. And when we wholly control a company, when we operate a company that we like, it is a reflection of us. It just is. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. The same thing with the church and Deseret Book. And as I mentioned earlier, I think when people have any issues with Deseret Book's content, the remarks of its CEO, the employment of, DEI, woke, leftist, activist type people, like anything like that, while they might have opinions in a private context, now they've got spiritual wrestling to do because of our church culture mixing all this up. And, but if it were a bad thing, then the leaders of the church would do something about it and all of that, right? Rightly or wrongly, it can lead people to question the church. And then those people start to question the gospel because they equate the church with the gospel. And I just think it's all unnecessary. I just don't even know what point this company serves anymore. I think Deseret Book, that frankly the church should shift to online only distribution for church authorized publications. Take all the books from the leaders of the church. I think a lot of the books from leaders of the church are just kind of like, I don't know, not needed, not doctrinally weighty, but fine. They want to publish books and whatever. I got no problem with that. I publish books. It's great. I have zero problem with that. They want to do that. I think all the church authorized publications from leaders of the church should be directly distributed by the church in online only distribution, which the church already has and does. It does it for food storage and all kinds of other stuff. I don't think the church needs to be selling other people's books, whether Hillary Clinton's or Connor Boyak's. I think they, then can get rid of all the art, all the kitsch. People can get it elsewhere. There's Hobby Lobby, there's Amazon, there's a billion places to get that stuff. Etsy, up the wazoo. I think we get back to letting people buy any garments, undergarments they want and applying the markings and the labels to them, as used to be the case. That's new information to you. You can go to sundaymusings.org, search garments. You'll find that musing. I just don't think this business is needed. And I think the potential downsides outweigh any of the potential upsides. And I think Deseret Book has made some mistakes. They've embraced the slow stain of the world. And because it's a church-owned enterprise, that is a reflection on the church itself. The goals that the church has for this institution can be met in a narrowed down, online-only distribution model, which is where people want to shop anyways. Leverage existing distribution systems. It'll be cheaper. We can get rid of all the retail bloat that costs a ton of money. You can get rid of all the other products that you don't need. And if it's truly about like getting ideas out there, as it once was, the whole purpose of Deseret Book was to help educate the members, and provide the materials of the church and the church leaders out to the members. Like, again, as Laurel herself has said, now it's in the app. It's easy. It's broader distribution. It's easily translated. It's easily updated. It's easily added to. Like, we've got it figured out. And for anyone who wants books, new or old, we have existing distribution systems that will be far more efficient and effective and cheaper for the church to operate than to maintain the institution and all of its junk that is sold in it that is not needed. So, in sum, while also shutting down or selling off KSL and Deseret News, we should do the same with Deseret Book. Tell me in the comments what you think. You disagree? You got other examples that I didn't mention of where Deseret Book has veered off course? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you there.